The wind moved low over the plains that night, sighing through the broken boards of the Whitlock Ranch barn, whispering secrets to the dark. The girl huddled in the hay smelled of dust and rain, her threadbare shawl pulled high over her head, trembling with every creak of the old structure. She hadn't meant to end up there. Just another traveler passing through a country that didn't have mercy for the hungry. But when the storm rolled in and thunder cracked over the open land, she had slipped inside the barn, unseen. Or so she thought. The owner, Eli Whitlock, had been standing by the window of his farmhouse, watching the horizon flicker white. He'd seen the flash of movement near the barn doors, a small shape darting through lightning, and his hand had gone to his revolver out of habit, though he hadn't drawn it. Bandits, drifters, even desperate men had found shelter on his land before, and the last one had nearly cost him his life. But something about that movement had been light, small, and when he finally went out to check, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, he found her curled beneath the horse blanket, shivering beside his mare. He stood for a long moment in silence, watching her chest rise and fall. She looked young, no older than 20, but her hands, crossed under her cheek, told another story. Calloused, rough, worn thin by work. When she startled awake, her eyes went wide, terrified, as if she expected to be dragged out into the storm. I'll leave, she stammered, sitting up too fast. Please, sir, I'll go. I didn't mean no harm. Eli shook his head slowly. Storm's too rough for that. You stay put. She hesitated, uncertain if she'd heard right. Stay. He nodded once, closing the door behind him. The thunder rumbled. Ain't gonna throw someone out in this weather. That was the first thing he said to her. Just that. No name, no question, no kindness beyond simple decency. But to a girl who hadn't known kindness in months, it felt like warmth itself. She gave a small nod and sank back into the hay, watching him as he moved about the barn. He checked the horses, made sure the latch held on the feed bins, then tossed her another blanket without looking at her. When he left, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. By morning, the storm had passed and the sky was bruised purple with dawn. Eli found her outside, kneeling by the trough, washing her face with cold water. The sunlight caught on her wet hair. It was the color of chestnuts after rain. When she saw him, she froze again, like a deer. He said nothing at first, just leaned against the post. Got a name? He asked finally. She hesitated, then whispered, Clara. He nodded once. You eat breakfast yet, Clara? She shook her head, unsure if it was a trap, unsure if he'd laugh or curse her for being there. Well, he said simply, come on, then. That morning, she sat at the edge of his kitchen table, stiff and quiet, as he placed a plate of biscuits and eggs before her. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and every sound, the clink of fork, the scrape of chair, felt too loud. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why her hands were scraped raw, or why she'd been sleeping in his barn. Maybe he knew she wouldn't answer anyway. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. You live here alone. He nodded, eyes still on his plate. Used to be 3 of us. My brother and his wife. They're gone now. I'm sorry, she said quietly. He looked up then, really looked at her. Don't be. Everyone loses someone out here. It's just the way of things. For days, she stayed in the barn, helping around the ranch where she could, feeding the chickens, patching fences, mending an old saddle. Eli never asked her to leave, never offered to let her stay, either. But every time he found her there, he left a little food, or a clean rag, or an old jacket draped over the stall door. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice carried the slow patience of a man used to silence. The town whispered about him sometimes, the quiet rancher who'd lost too much. Some said he was haunted, others said he just didn't care anymore. But one evening, when the sun was spilling gold over the fields and Clara was struggling to lift a bale of hay, Eli crossed the barn and took it from her hands. You'll throw your back out like that, he said. She frowned. I can do it. Didn't say you couldn't, he replied. Just said you shouldn't. She laughed softly for the first time since she'd arrived. It surprised them both. That night, after supper, he found her sitting by the corral, staring out at the stars. The wind tugged at her shawl. Ain't much out here, he said quietly, leaning on the fence beside her. There's peace, she murmured. That's more than I had. He turned his head toward her, the light from the lantern behind them flickering across his face. What were you running from, Clara? She hesitated, eyes fixed on the horizon. Men who don't take no for an answer. A town that didn't care. He nodded once. No judgment, no pity. Just understanding. You're safe here, he said simply. The words hit her harder than she expected. Safe. She hadn't felt that in years. That night, as she lay in the hay, her hands tucked under her cheek, she cried quietly for the first time since she'd buried her father 2 winters ago. Days bled into weeks. Clara learned the rhythm of the ranch. The sound of boots on the porch at dawn, the whistle of wind through the fence posts, the scent of fresh coffee that always drifted from the kitchen window. Eli worked from sunrise to dusk, quiet and steady, and though he rarely smiled, there was a gentleness in his eyes whenever he looked her way. She began to hum while she worked, old songs her mother had sung before the world grew cruel, and sometimes he'd pause his work just to listen. One evening, as autumn began to paint the hills gold, she stood at the fence watching him break a new horse. The animal kicked and reared, but Eli's calm voice and steady hands guided it, patient and sure. When the horse finally settled, he turned toward her, sweat streaking his temples, and she felt something twist warm inside her chest. It scared her. She'd seen men at their worst, had learned that trust was a dangerous thing to give. But Eli, he didn't ask, didn't demand, didn't expect. He just existed beside her, and somehow, that was enough. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. The barn was cold and the thin blanket she used did little against the chill. She tried to sleep, curled tight beneath it, but her teeth chattered so loudly she feared the horses would startle. She didn't notice Eli's footsteps until the barn door creaked open. He stood there holding an extra quilt, eyes soft in the lantern light. You'll freeze out here, he said simply. I'll be fine, she whispered. He hesitated, then stepped closer, setting the quilt beside her. No sense in being proud, Clara. Take it. When she finally pulled it around herself, she whispered a quiet, thank you. He nodded once, about to turn away, then paused. His voice was softer this time, lower, almost unsure. You know, the house has got a spare bed. If you ever get tired of the hay. She froze. The words hung between them, trembling in the cold air. He wasn't offering pity, and there was no hunger in his tone, just simple, human warmth. Still, her heart raced. I couldn't, she murmured. It wouldn't be right. He gave a faint smile, weary but kind. Ain't about right. It's about not catching your death in my barn. When he left, she sat there staring at the quilt for a long time, torn between fear and longing. No one had offered her safety without a price before. No one had meant it. That night, sleep came slow. She thought of his voice, steady and quiet, of the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. And when the wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors, she almost wished she'd said yes. Morning came with frost on the ground and fire in the hearth. Eli found her already awake, feeding the horses. When she saw him, she smiled shyly. You were right, she said softly. It was cold. He chuckled once under his breath. Told you. And though she still slept in the barn that night, something had changed between them, something small, fragile, like the first spark in a dark room. Neither of them spoke of it, but both felt it burning quietly inside. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel like a wanderer anymore. She felt home. Winter came down the mountains like a slow-moving ghost, frosting the plains in silence. Each dawn broke pale and cold, each night crept in sooner than the last. The Whitlock Ranch changed with the season, the air sharp with wood smoke, the ground hard under boot heels. Clara wrapped herself in the worn quilt Eli had given her, working from sunup to sundown, though her fingers were raw from the cold. Eli watched her sometimes from the porch, his breath fogging the air, wondering how someone so slight could carry such quiet strength. Weeks had passed since he'd first offered her the house bed. She hadn't taken it, though her eyes often lingered toward the farmhouse window glowing against the night. He'd said nothing since, respecting her silence, but every time the wind howled and the barn creaked, he found himself wide awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing she was out there in the cold. He'd grown used to solitude, even believed he deserved it, but now, every empty chair, every quiet corner seemed to ache with her absence. One morning, he found her collapsed near the trough, a bucket overturned beside her. Her skin was pale, her hands trembling violently. Panic hit him fast, faster than thought. He lifted her into his arms, her head lolling weakly against his chest, and carried her through the snow into the house. He laid her by the fire, wrapped her in blankets, and knelt beside her, whispering her name over and over until her eyes fluttered open. Eli. Her voice was fragile, barely there. "Don't you move," he said, his tone low but firm. "You hear me? You're safe now." He fed her spoonfuls of broth through the night, staying by her side while the storm outside raged like the world itself was trying to tear its way in. When she finally slept, her hand still resting in his, Eli leaned back in the chair, exhaustion tugging at him. He hadn't realized until then just how much she'd come to mean to him. By morning, she was stronger, color returning to her cheeks. When she tried to sit up, he stopped her with a gentle hand. "Don't," he said softly. "Doctor's on his way from town." She smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd worry so much. Didn't think I could," he murmured. Days passed, and she recovered slowly, sleeping in the spare room now, though each night she insisted she'd go back to the barn once she was better. He'd only shake his head and change the subject. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he'd hear her humming again, the same soft tune from the barn, and something inside him would settle. One evening, he found her standing by the window, watching snow fall under the full moon. The firelight traced gold against her hair, and for a moment, he forgot every word he meant to say.